So please help us understand a bit more about the context of the church in China today. And where is it going?
Well, China was getting quite free after Deng Xiaoping took power, 78. China began to open up. He was the man who started what's called the four modernizations, and he basically made China look outward for the first time. And he allowed a limited form of capitalism. Now, it was still under the control of the party, but he allowed capitalism to be much more the way things were distributed. You know, he used to say it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So he put ideology to the side. And so really from those periods, the 80s and the 90s, and even the early 2000s up till about 2012, China was really looking outward. And I remember even in the late 90s traveling around China, and you would even find amazing things like in bookshops. You couldn't still buy a Bible. You never could. You could only buy a Bible in a ThreeSelf bookshop. But even so, you could get these books that were excerpts of the Bible, and they were so big, they were almost the complete Bible. And then you had all these intellectuals as well. They were called the culture Christians. They weren't necessarily believers or had a personal faith in Jesus Christ, but they believed that the Christian way of life, the values that Christianity had, was the best way to organize Chinese society. So you got a real big expansion. And what tended to happen was that in the 80s, really the majority of the church were the movements among the farmers in the countryside. But then you got this huge shift as China industrialized very fast. And then you began to get whole new movements in the cities. And so we talk about the urban professional church, which is probably very significant now. It's wealthy, it's in the cities, and it's made up of professionals. And that's very new again. And these are the ones that wanted to build their own buildings, actually, just before this crackdown. So the church was growing enormously and in different ways. It was no longer, to put it crudely, a peasant movement. I mean, I remember walking around a city in the early 1990s even, and I was talking to someone just on the street, and they said, "Christianity, isn't that just for peasants?"
Yeah.
You know, and that was a typical attitude. Well, not any longer. You know, so that's the big context, and then you get this movement. I remember even because I was the head of the World Watch list at the time, we even had discussions as to whether China belonged in the top 50 at all. And then along came this new individual, Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping. He took power essentially in 2013. And since then, he has restored ideology to the center of Chinese society. Now, there is still a lot of capitalism, but it's very controlled. And the church is an object of suspicion. You are allowed to be a Christian in China under certain conditions. It's not back to the time of Mao in the 60s, where he basically banned all religion. But it's very, very controlled, and the ideology is central. I remember talking to a pastor not so long ago, and he said, every time I preach a sermon, I am required to praise the government. He said, I don't like it. I don't like it. So this is really new, and this is why, China shooting back up to number 17 on the World Watch list reflects this new approach. And of course, it's not just ideology that is driving it; it's technology, because the ability to create surveillance over churches is like never before because of the smartphone and this kind of thing. So they always talk about big data meets big brother in China, and that's the two sort of elements going together. So it's a hard time for Chinese Christians, historically speaking. Though the Chinese leaders very often are quite good at actually seeing this bizarrely as a benefit, because they often say, well, if we had built all these big mega churches, would that have been good for us? But Xi Jinping came in and it was no longer possible. Maybe it was good that we went, as it were, back to the home. This is kind of odd, because house churches traditionally, they're not at home. They're in buildings, they're in factory floors, they're in, courtyards, they're in caves. They're not really in homes, but now they are in the home again. That's kind of some are discovering a new intensity of fellowship as a result of that.
One question I'm frequently asked is, how is the relationship between the ThreeSelf movement and the house church movement today? Many has understood these two movements as opposing one another, one spiritually dead and the other vibrantly alive. How do you see this? And often is our understanding maybe shaped by history more than the present?
A very good question. One generalization I think that does hold is that the ThreeSelf is very political at the top, but it's really quite evangelical all the rest of the way down. And in the cities particularly, you will often find that house churches and ThreeSelf congregations bleed together. For example, if there's a particularly good teacher in a ThreeSelf church on a Sunday afternoon, for example, a lot of house church Christians will go along. They have no problem entering a ThreeSelf church. And you get some coming together in that respect. It's a little different in the cities, in the countryside, where there does tend to still be more of a distance. But of course, the original distance came about for good reasons, because very often in the 80s and especially in the 70s, but the 80s and even up into the 90s, basically the ThreeSelf was this shop window to tell the world that all was well with China. And it also had this other role of spying on the Christians that wouldn't join it. But although there's some of that left, it's not as bad as it was. So I would say there's really quite a lot of flow through.
We are a people of the book, the Bible, one of Open Doors' core values. Our history is deeply connected to the call to make the Bible available where it's hard to get hold of. The newly published 1 Million Miracles book tells the story of how Open Doors was able to bring in 1 million Bibles into China during one night, and that was a miracle. Many Norwegians has also seen God's faithfulness crossing borders with Bible and serving persecuted Christians also in China. What is the situation and need for Bibles in China today?
Yes, it's difficult to assess because, with the Chinese church being so large and growing so massively. What was interesting, it's interesting historically that book you have just produced, the story of Project Pearl, where 1 million are taken in one night to the Chinese coast and distributed by the house churches, at least 80% of them, in 1981, had a direct bearing on the founding of the so-called Amity printing press in Nanjing. I remember once talking to Han Wanzhao. He was the chairman of the China Christian Council, and he admitted privately, though he would never say this publicly, that they felt that after Pearl, they had to print Bibles legally inside the country. And they were also receiving pressure from, I think, President Jimmy Carter asked them to do it and that kind of thing too. So there was a connection between the two. Now, the Amity Press has printed probably about 100 million Bibles for China alone. I think they printed more than 200 million. But for use in China, they've printed about 100 million since it started in 87. So that has made an important impact on the need. There may be places, though, somewhere where Bibles are still needed and it's hard to get. As far as I am aware, it's never really been possible to go into a bookshop in China and buy a Bible. The only place you can get one, legally speaking, is at a ThreeSelf bookstore. They're usually open after a service. They may not be open all year round. Now, there was a period, of course, where you had a lot of Christian bookstores in China that sold Bibles, but it wasn't legal. They were allowed to sell Christian literature, but they weren't actually allowed to sell Bibles. So there's probably a need for more, if we think that the church is growing at maybe 7-8% a year, there must still be a need for Bibles themselves. Our focus, I must say, is much more on training people in the reading and the living of the book. How do you, as Brother Andrew used to say, how do you live by the book? We've got to live up to the book, he said. And that's our main focus, actually, when we do training in China, is that, yes, you've got a Bible, but, how do you make sure that it changes you, that you know how to find the face of God in the text? How do you know how to get the doctrines out in such a way that heresies do not flourish? So that the job isn't done just because, the Bible has been delivered. So that we tend to say our major focus is much more on understanding the Bible rather than Bible supply. But there will always be Bible supply needs, I'm sure, in China, given the size of the church and how underground much of it is having to be. I mean, it's very difficult now to download a Bible on an app. That's almost literally, I think, almost always blocked off now by the great Chinese firewall. And I mean, in the past, literally tens of millions have downloaded Bibles onto their smartphones.
Ron, listen to you. I wonder, how has your relationship with the persecuted church and Chinese Christians impacted your own walk with Jesus? And when you look to the church in the West, what is the most important lessons we could learn from Christians in China?
Well, I'm an honorary member of a house church in Beijing that I often take my friends to. I can't anymore, but I used to. And the service would always start with the pastor going around everyone and asking the question, what are your wounds for Christ this week? And that, I believe, is a wonderful starting point for a church service, because it brings up the fact that the Christian, as you live out the faith and you threaten evil, there will be a battle. And you're checking in to make sure that the battle is happening. Because if evil is not reacting to you, maybe you're not threatening it at all. Maybe your Christianity is too far back from the problem that is threatening your neighborhood. Maybe it might be drug gangs. Maybe it might be crazy consumerism. Maybe it might be some dreadful addictions that are in the society. You've got to come against them in the power of Christ, and they will react to you. And so I take that very seriously. I want to know that where I am and in the church that I'm in, that we have looked around us and we said, where is the evil that we need to come against? And how do we do this? And I help a ministry in a city not far from where I live. And I always make a distinction sometimes between helping the victim and shaking the system.
Yeah.
Because we have a van and we give out hot meals to prostitutes and give them a sandwich, give them a safe space for a few hours if need be. And everybody loves that. But if we then say, okay, now we need to try to stop why these prostitutes are on the street in the first place, then we need to go to the pimps. That's when it gets dangerous. Because that's the system you're starting to threaten. And so I always take that and I receive that as a lesson, I would say, from the Chinese church. And they always say, look, the gospel isn't going to grow unless you've paid a price for it. It's when people see that it's cost you something, that they look and say, this Christianity might be worth looking into. Otherwise, if it's safe and you're just like everybody else, it's only words.
That's really something we should let us be challenged by, really. But this is a prayer night, and we should also pray for China. So how can we pray for China?
Well, I think we should continue to be very ambitious in prayer. And so pray for China to become a Christian superpower.
Yeah.
We know it's going to become a superpower. In fact, it probably is already. But why not a Christian superpower? Think of the numbers and how they grow. You know, there's a projection that was made in 2015 that if the church in China grew at the same rate as it has since 1980, then you could have 300 million Christians by 2030 and maybe 600 million by 2040, 2045. That would really change the dynamics if that's the case. So I would keep praying for that. Another prayer point that the Christians ask for is, we want to serve the government. We want to help the government. We want to help China become a more caring society. And so there is a big social care crisis in China. There's a social care crisis in all our societies. But in China, you have a lot of very elderly people. I think that the last number I saw is that 278 million are over the age of 65 in China. And so the Chinese state cannot cope. And the Chinese family is struggling to cope. And so the churches say, well, can we not help with this crisis? Can we not help start care homes or communities and do social care in cooperation with the government? And in that way, they're trying to make sure that Christianity changes society. They don't want this revival to come and go and not really change society. And so they really are asking prayers about that. At the moment, the government says, no, this is our issue. We'll solve it. We'll sort it. Go away. But the Chinese church leadership really feel like this may be the key way in which they can show that Christianity is good for society. I would keep praying also for the leaders of the churches, because they feel under terrible pressure from the new regulations to always be positive about the government and the direction of China, and to mention the ideology and so on. Keep praying for them, because it's not easy. It's very hard, and even in a private settings, you just never know. You know, it's like you're never sure now if somebody is listening in, and there's a kind of constant background pressure to that is felt, and can result in, you know, health problems as well. And I also think that, you know, since we're still coming out of COVID, the Chinese church, I think, in the period of COVID, reached out to the wider church, particularly for teaching materials and so on through the internet. And I think there was a new connectedness there that occurred. And please pray that that would continue, because the Chinese they're quite upfront about this. They say we have what's called a middle kingdom mentality. In other words, they're the center of the universe. So they don't need anybody else. There is this attitude in China that we're the boss now. And even in the church, that can present as, you know, well, we've had the greatest revival in the history of Christianity. We'll try to take it to you. You know, but the attitude very often is, well, yeah, but we need to come to you. We need to learn from you, you know, as well. And so this could be a new opportunity for a connectedness, a new connectedness, as a result of COVID, which I think has drawn us all closer together.
Ron, thank you again for sharing with us. It's been a privilege for us to spend time with you today. Really. Thank you for giving us your insights and what God is doing in China. And most important, important areas for prayer, and also for the encouragement you have given to us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ulla, and thank you each of you for your faithful prayers. And